This Week in the Triangle. My name is Stephen Horn. I'm an independent journalist here in North Carolina, and welcome to this stream, this broadcast where I like to talk about some local news from the past week here in the Greater Triangle area of North Carolina. And this week we are talking about crime. This is a little different than the usual topics where it's a range of stories from the week. This week, we're going to really dive into some crime statistics, some crime thoughts, thinking about how we can look at crime. And this is really inspired by Trump's crime crackdown in DC, where he is bringing in federal personnel, the National Guard, to bring law and order to the streets of DC, which obviously has people quibbling about where DC exactly ranks among, the cities of America, how bad it actually is. And so we're going to talk about some facts here, specifically relating to facts in North Carolina and in the Triangle area, the 11 counties that I cover here. So I think one flaw, one mistake that conservatives sometimes make when talking about crime is to attribute it too much to the police. Like, if you have a high crime rate, that must be because the police are doing a bad job. If you have a low crime rate, it's because the police are doing a good job. But let's be honest, Maine and New Hampshire do not have the lowest crime rates in the country because the police there are exceptionally good at doing their job. It's because of the people there. The people there don't commit as many crimes as they do in some place like DC, as they do in Louisiana or Mississippi or Alabama or Alaska or some of these, New Mexico, some of these states with much higher crime rates. All police, the essential role of police is to respond to crime. They investigate, they make arrests, they enforce the law, but they only have so much of an effect and stopping crime going forward. And there are two main ways that the police can actually deter crime. And one is by striking fear into the hearts of criminals. Sometimes that is, by patrolling. They see a police car drive by, they say, you know what, I'm not committing crime today. And sometimes that is just, the culture that they set by aggressively going after crime. Criminals get the idea, hey, I can't just get away with crime. But the other way that they prevent crime is by keeping criminals segregated from the general population, keeping them away from their would-be victims, and that is either through imprisonment or by death, though we don't do that as often anymore. So basically, the concept behind that is pretty simple. If a criminal is in prison during the time that he is in prison or jail, he is not committing any crimes against members of the general public. Now, he may be committing crimes against other prisoners, but generally, we don't count those as much because they're also prisoners, which is a whole nother philosophical discussion. So those are the two ways, creating a culture of fear, a culture of deterrence for criminals, not for law-abiding citizens, creating a culture of fear for criminals, the idea that they will be punished if they commit a crime. But that is, you can't rely on that to eliminate crime, because a lot of crime, especially violent crime, is not rational. Now, there are some criminals who operate as businessmen, in which case you can deter a significant portion of crime by making it so that they know that if they commit this crime, they'll be caught. But crimes like domestic violence, crimes like assault, crimes like a murder, if those are impulsive crimes, then putting some consequence in the future isn't necessarily going to stop the people. There's the experiments they do where they do them with children. I think they do with adults as well, or they say you can have a cookie now, or if you wait 30 minutes, you can have 2 cookies. Some people go for the cookie, some people wait for the bigger payoff. And if you have a population with a large number of people who do not have that self-control, having some threat, of punishment in the future isn't going to necessarily deter them in the moment. So we can't rely on vigorous policing to completely eliminate crime. But let's look at some data to see where we are at on the spectrum. Are we close to that point where adding more police isn't going to result in more safety, or are we very far from that point? And I'm going to make the argument that we are very far from the point where adding more resources would be, ineffective. We are not nearly at the saturation point where, we're having more police, having them investigate more crimes, having them patrol more. we are nowhere near that point where adding more, would be expected to have no effect. So let's first start by talking about some of the limitations in measuring crime. You know, when we're talking about how bad is crime, we can go off of anecdotes, we can go off of the stories that people have, the experiences, but often that doesn't give that doesn't necessarily give the big picture. There's a number of factors that can distort that. Who is having those experiences? Is it people who are good at communicating? Then their experience might go out more, or if you're focusing on different things. So generally, when looking at the big picture point of view, we like to use statistics, but the measures we have for statistics are kind of inherently flawed. And so one of those main measures is by measuring the crime rate as reported by police departments. So this is something like the FBI's Uniform Crime Reporting Program, where police departments, law enforcement agencies, whether that's city police, state police, sheriff's departments, whatnot, they report, hey, these are the crimes that we come across. They report that to the FBI. The FBI puts it all together so we can, have some kind of standardized comparison to say, hey, this place is doing better. Hey, how does our state compare to other states? How does our city compare to other cities? But the inherent flaw here is, kind of, and a quote from a description of the program on the FBI's website is that it's limited to crimes brought to their attention, crimes brought to the attention of law enforcement departments. And so the question is, are we comparing apples to oranges? Are all crimes being reported? And is there different levels of crimes being reported in different departments? And I would propose that there is, in fact, sort of a paradox here where departments with low crime, where there is aggressive policing, where they are closer to that saturation point of law enforcement resources, they will have a higher percentage of crimes that actually get reported. Whereas a department where they struggle to even investigate all the homicides, let alone the petty crime, let alone getting your window smashed, maybe getting punched in the street. If the department is unable to process those crimes, the citizens won't have the trust to report them. So the question is, what do those numbers actually look like? What percentage of crimes are actually reported to the police? Because the crime rates in something like the UCR, that is only crimes that are either reported to the police or discovered by the police. They come across a crime, doesn't necessarily need someone to report it, but that could be a relatively small percentage of all crimes that are committed, or that could be pretty much all of the crimes that are committed. If all victims say, yes, I'm going to take the time to report the crime to the police, however small, that crime rate could be very high, very, very close to 100%. Probably never would actually get to 100%. So what are we actually at? Do we know? Well, there's another way that we measure crime, and that is through the National Crime Victimization Survey. That is by the Department of Justice, and that is a survey. It's just what it sounds like from the title. They interview victims, they do a survey, and then they do their math estimates with their samples and whatnot to say, hey, how many people are being victimized each year? And the numbers we have from that, they also ask them, did you report this crime to the police? And they can, kind of compare those numbers, the police numbers versus the people who say they have reported. And what the National Crime Victimization Survey, the data from that indicates that less than half of all crimes are reported to the police. So in North Carolina, those numbers are for the period of 2020 to 2022, only 47.2% of violent victimizations were reported to the police, and only 41.6% of property victimizations were reported to the police. Now, I didn't see the breakdown city by city, which is, a limitation of the data because they're doing estimates. So, the smaller you're trying to measure, the smaller the sample size would be, and the more inaccurate those estimations would be. So there's kind of flaws in both methods. Measuring it from the police side is more, they miss a bunch of crimes, the crimes that are never reported to them, but is much more granular. You can say, okay, the Durham police reported this many crimes, the Raleigh police, or, the Lee County Sheriff's Department, maybe, or Person County, whichever law enforcement department is much more granular. We know this is the number of crimes reported, in this jurisdiction. So that's kind of the flaws of both methods. But when we see, okay, over half of crimes aren't being reported, then we know, hey, there could definitely be some variations in crime rates between cities, where you could have more or less crimes being reported, and that can even vary by area, because one of the reports put out from the NCVS data compared the rate of reporting in rural, suburban, and urban areas. And you can look up that report if you want. It's kind of interesting. But one of the biggest gaps in reporting between different areas is with rape and sexual assault victimizations, where only 13% of rape and sexual assault victimizations in urban areas were reported to the police, compared to 52% in rural areas. So this is the biggest gap in those numbers, based on difference of percentage being reported, where that's it's 4 times more likely, and only 13% in urban areas. That is what those victims are reporting when they take this victimization survey. Only 13% of those respondents who say they were victimized in an urban area and by rape or sexual assault, only 13% of them said, yes, I reported that to the police. So the question really is, does law enforcement, does the attitudes, the practice, the policies of law enforcement influence whether crimes will be reported? And I would say the answer, based on the data we have, is yes. So one thing the NCVS asks victims is, if you didn't report your crime, why didn't you report it? Actually, they ask it both ways. If you did report the crime, why did you report it? If you didn't report the crime, why didn't you report it? And so we do have some idea on this. So this is the data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, who is calculating these numbers, reporting them. So the percent of violent victimizations not reported to police by most important reason for not reporting, 2023. So the most common reason, above a quarter of them said that they dealt with it another way. So that could mean any number of things. But the second most common reason, police could not or would not do anything to help. So over a quarter of the people who said, I didn't report my crime to the police, was because they did not believe the police could or would do anything to help. That is a pretty big number, over a quarter. And they, once again, I didn't see that number broken down by jurisdiction, but we can put our thinking caps on, think a little logically. Presumably, the people's trust in the police will influence that number. If the victims know that the police will do something, if they can see the evidence of that through the police being active in policing and responding to the reports, if the police have that reputation, then people are presumably much less likely to not report it, not report a crime, not reporting being the victim of the crime, because they believe the police won't do anything. So from those numbers, we can conclude, hey, there might be, based on how vigorous, based on what reputation the police have, and often reputations are deserved, that is a pretty common finding in sociology. This is kind of an aside, but that stereotypes generally have some basis in fact. So if the majority of people in a city believe that the police aren't really aggressive in pursuing crime, it's probably because they aren't. And so, there could be some variance in the perception versus the truth, but generally, if people perceive the police to not be active in investigating crime, it's probably because they aren't. And so, based on this, we can say, okay, a pretty significant chunk of crimes that aren't reported, the police have some control over that. Obviously, they can't force people to report crime, because they don't even know who is necessarily a victim of crime until they report it. But based on this, we can see that the trust in police likely has a pretty significant variance in, what crimes, what percentage of crimes get reported to the police. And so to follow on with that, let's get into some of the data on crime prevention through incarceration. Because like I mentioned earlier, criminals who are in prison or jail cannot commit crimes against members of the general public. So the question, how effective that is in preventing crimes, is really what percentage of crimes are committed by repeat criminals versus what percentage are one-off. Someone commits a crime once, would never commit a crime for the rest of their life, then putting them in prison wouldn't lower the crime rate because they would never commit another crime. Well, we know this is not reality. This is not the case. This is not the numbers we have. So for here, I'm relying on some data from the North Carolina Sentencing and Policy Advisory Commission. So this is for the same state. This is for fiscal year 2019, and I didn't see exactly what months, but basically a year period that they analyzed and put out a report in 2023. And so this is convictions by offense class and prior record level. This is for felony convictions, what their prior record level was. So the data here is that at least 75% of felony convictions in North Carolina had a prior record of some sort. Now, to get a prior record level of 2 or higher, you either had to have been previously convicted of a felony, or it could be multiple misdemeanors, or there are some other aggravating factors. But basically, if you have no prior convictions, you are in prior record level 1, and only 25% of the felony convictions were prior record level 1. So 25% or lower had a clean criminal record prior to being convicted. So what does that tell us? Well, that tells us that the vast majority of crime is, at least the vast majority of crime that people are being convicted for, is crime committed by people who commit multiple crimes. They have a pattern of behavior. This isn't a one-off incident. This is most crime. If we extrapolate the crime that there is conviction for to the crime which goes unreported or unsolved, which we'll get to later with a clearance rate, if we extrapolate from the convictions, yes, the vast majority of crime is committed by people who have a pattern of committing crime. So if you take someone who has a pattern of committing crime and you put them in prison or jail, for that period they are incarcerated, whatever pattern of crime they would engaged in against the general public, they are not able to do so, and that is a way we can expect vigorous policing to reduce the crime rate. And we can look at it from the other point of view. Recidivism rates. This is data produced by that same commission. I believe this is fiscal year 2021, so a different year of data that they are analyzing. But this is the number of recidivist arrests for, the report goes into both probationers, people who are on probation, as well as prisoners who are released in the 2 years after prisoners are released. Let's see, what is the number here? Okay, so in the 2 years after prisoners were released, 44% of them were rearrested. Think about that. 44%, and that's not lifetime recidivism, and that's not 44% committed crimes. That is 44% were caught, allegedly, according to the police. Once again, arrests aren't convictions, but it takes years more to be able to get that data of the conviction rate, because most cases take a while from the arrest to make it through the system. So 44% of people released from North Carolina prisons were rearrested within 2 years. Think about that. This reinforces the data regarding prior convictions, is that a huge amount of the crime is committed by people who have a pattern of committing crime. And when those people are in prison, they're not committing crime against members of the general public. Once again, they still be committing crime, they still being committing violent sexual assault against other prisoners, but the general public is safe from them while they are incarcerated. So, with that in mind, what can police do? how do we know? Do we have enough police? Do we have too many police? Do we have just the right number of police? And to answer that question, to give you some idea, I would turn to clearance rates. So we previously talked about what percentage of crime actually makes it into police statistics through being reported. The number of crimes that they are aware of. So the clearance rates basically means out of the crimes that police are aware of, how many of them are solved. Now there's a bit a bit of variance in that exact definition. For homicides, those can be cleared through conviction. If they say, okay, you committed murder, you're tried, convicted, whatever, okay, this crime is cleared, we know you did it, we've got the conviction. We can also be cleared if they determine, okay, this homicide was justified, it was self-defense. That is another way they can clear it. But generally, for robbery, they're probably not going to be saying you are justified in robbing that person, whatnot. But basically, it's the amount of crimes that are solved. That's kind of the rough way to think about that. So, if you're theoretically, if you have too few police, you would see that reflected in the clearance rates. They wouldn't be able to solve many crimes because they would have more on their plate than they could deal with. And we would also see a level of prioritization. So if the police don't have enough resources, what are they going to do? They're going to prioritize the most important crimes, and other less important crimes, maybe only are investigated if, if the evidence is readily available to them, if they can easily prove who did it, versus for the most serious crimes, they might put in a little more effort. So if you reach a saturation level of police, I would say that would be the level where police are able to investigate all crimes and, find all the possible perpetrators if there is any evidence that they could possibly find. Now, obviously, that wouldn't be a granular point. That would be sort of a curve, declining returns, where maybe if they spent twice as many hours investigating a case, maybe they could find something, versus we're not nearly there yet. And the evidence I would present in regards to that, specifically in the Triangle area of North Carolina, which is where I focus on crime, where I focus on coverage, would be the offense clearance rates. So this is the 2023 data. That was the latest data I could find. That was released by the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigations in regards to the clearance rate for certain index offenses. So basically, they take a couple offenses and say, hey, we're going to track these for all the departments, release the clearance rates. And so for the total index offenses in 2023, there were 55,000 in the 11 counties that I cover as the Greater Triangle area. And out of those 55,000 cases, the total clearance rate, 11%. 11%. Now, to be fair, the most serious crime, homicide, has a much higher rate. So what is a clearance rate for murder, for homicide? They sometimes use the terms a little more interchangeably, though they're technically, murder is unjustified homicide. So if it's self-defense, it's homicide, but it's not murder. So what is a clearance rate for murder? 44%. And that is the highest clearance rate for any of these categories. Why? Because they're prioritizing. They're putting the most effort, the most resources. It's the most serious offense. Much more serious than getting punched in the face is getting murdered in the face. But if they're clearing less than half of murders are solved, I would say that would be a clear indication we do not have enough police. We do not have enough investigators. We do not have enough resources. If the most prioritized crime, they still can't get above a 50% solve rate, a 50% clearance rate, that seems to be a major problem. Now, part of that, not necessarily something the police can solve on their own, because police often rely on witnesses, on people being willing to cooperate, maybe provide evidence, provide camera footage, whatever. So it's not necessarily totally the police's fault, but it seems a strong indicator that perhaps the police could solve more crimes if they had more resources to investigate. And I think that is even more proved if we look at the drop off in clearance rates. So the clearance rate for murder, 44%. So this is the total across these 11 counties. I have the table of data here. You can find that on triangletrumpet.news. In this weekly roundup article, the crime edition. So 44% of murders are cleared. For rape, 12%. Robbery, 17%. Aggravated assault, 22%. Burglary, 11%. Larceny, 10%. And motor vehicle theft, 5%. 5%. If you get your vehicle stolen, there's only a 5% chance that they're identifying the culprit, clearing that crime. Now, motor vehicle thefts, I didn't see a specific stat related to this in the victimization survey, but I would assume that crimes where insurance might require you to submit a report, there might be somewhat of a higher report rate. I don't know that for sure, but if you look at these statistics, it definitely indicates to me, when you have going down all the way from 44% to 5% between the most serious crimes and what would be less serious for them, presumably, the larcenies, the motor vehicle theft, not as serious as the rapes, the assaults, the murders. When you see that drop off, that indicates prioritization. They don't have enough resources, so they prioritize the most serious crime. And so to me, looking at these statistics is, it's abysmal. It's abysmal. So less than half of the crimes that are committed are less than half crimes are reported. And of those crimes that are reported, 10% are solved. That means about 5% of all crimes committed are solved. 5%. 5%. That's crazy. Now, the most serious crimes, the murder, more likely to be cleared, to be solved. Whereas less serious crimes, if your vehicle is stolen, that is an abysmal rate of clearing crimes. Because this is why my perspective is not just merely, okay, we have a higher crime rate per capita, so therefore we need more police. I think that's kind of a very surface way to look at it. But when we dig into the numbers and we see that, they're solving only a tiny amount of crime that is committed, yeah, I would say that's a pretty strong indicator. We need more police. We need more police so that people feel comfortable. People feel like they are not wasting their time by reporting crime to the police. And we need more police so that they can put these repeat criminals behind bars. Because if they can increase the clearance rate by 5%, that's not just the number of crimes that they're solving. That's the number of crimes that they're preventing, because the same people who commit the crimes they're able to solve are also the people committing the crimes they aren't able to solve, the crimes that are unreported. That is the data we have. That is the extrapolation of the data we have. So we have the data on convictions, repeat convictions. We can extrapolate that data to offenders, people committing crimes. Most crimes, it appears, are committed by people who have a pattern of committing crimes. So if you're able to interrupt that pattern, imprison them, then through that period of imprisonment, they're not committing crimes against the general population. And I might be repeating myself, but that is for emphasis. That is to hammer at the point home, because a lot of people don't seem to get this. So with that in mind, let's run through a couple stories from this previous week, specifically thinking of it through the mindset of, okay, with more or less resources, would the police be solving this crime? Would it be cleared? And also, with more or less police resources, would this crime even be counted in the crime statistics? So the first story we have is an undercover sting results in 8 drug-related arrests. This is a story from Raleigh, but it is not specifically involving the Raleigh police. It is the alcohol law enforcement. So the North Carolina, they enforce the alcohol rules, and they can investigate crime that is being committed in or association with, establishments that are licensed to sell alcohol. So these specific drug-related arrests are not, the alcohol licensed establishments, but they received a tip about about basically drugs being sold outside, establishments that were licensed to serve alcohol. So it fell under the jurisdiction of the North Carolina alcohol law enforcement. So undercover agents made some drug buys. They tracked this drug dealer back to his house. They arrest him. They get him to flip on his supplier, and they ultimately make 8 arrests for a total of 101 felony charges for 8 defendants. That's a lot of felonies. And some of those felonies are for dealing within 1,000 feet of a school, which is in this case Wake Young Men's Leadership Academy. This is in Raleigh, I believe, a little east of downtown, which is, I guess a higher penalty than dealing drugs ordinarily. So, looking at it through our perspective, would these crimes be reported? Would these crimes make it into the crime statistics if not for, the use of law enforcement resources? And it looks like the answer is no. So they got a tip. Now, maybe that tip would result in 1 offense. But when they investigate, they track it back, they find, 8 different individuals. Seems to me that that's going to be reported as a higher crime rate. So this would be an instance where the police, a law enforcement department being active in investigating and pursuing crime, will actually boost their crime numbers, which might give you a false impression of, what crime is going on. So this behavior, the drug dealing, would go on. There would be more crime if police were investigating, but it wouldn't be counted as crime unless they do investigate and catch these people, which is sort of the paradox there. Because they're investigating crime, the crime numbers are actually higher. That is the gap between the statistics and the reality. In reality, there'd be more crime without the investigation. In the statistics, there's more crime because they do the investigation. So we can't get too caught up in statistics. Having a little trouble speaking now. We can't get too caught up in statistics because in this case, like more investigation results in higher crime numbers, but less crime. And our goal is not lower crime numbers, it's less crime. So for our next story here is a statutory rapist caught with CP material just days after finishing a 12-year sentence for statutory rape. This is Joshua Allen Morgan, 38 years old, a registered sex offender, and in 2013 he was charged in Wake Superior Court with 3 counts of statutory rape of a girl under 16. At the time, he was 26. So he pled down to attempted statutory rape and was sentenced to 12 to 19 years in prison. And so he got out after his minimum sentence of 12 years, and just a few days later, according to the Wake County Sheriff's Office, the probation and parole officers found child sexual assault material on his phone involving girls aged 10 to 12 during a probation check. So, related to the crime which he was convicted of, and just days after being let out of prison, they find this material on his phone, according to the sheriff's office. Kind of goes to my earlier point about recidivism. So he would be in that 44% who was arrested within 2 years because he was arrested within 1 or 2 weeks. Okay, I think it was, I believe it was August 8th he was released. August 13th he was, or I guess, yeah, 8 days. So August 5th to August 13th he was out, and that is when he was rearrested. So in this case, if we count the parole officers as law enforcement, which they're enforcing the laws, then once again, because of their activity, we have the crime numbers going up. If the parole officers weren't checking his phone, if they never found this, he would still be committing that crime, but it wouldn't be counted in the crime numbers. But obviously, if he is committing the crime and they catch him, that's less crime, putting him back in jail, keeping him from preying on the citizens of Wake County. So less crime, more crime statistics. And our next story here is Raleigheites complain of homeless harassment. So if you're familiar with Reddit, you probably know that it is a pretty left-leaning site, and this is very true of every subreddit for, a particular locality. So the North Carolina subreddit, way further left in the state of North Carolina. Raleigh, the city itself, votes Democrat, but our Raleigh subreddit is even more left than that. But even so, we had a thread last week where people were frankly discussing their experiences with the homeless. So, one user basically said, anyone else live very close to a large homeless camp? I hope this post doesn't get too controversial, but it's getting to a point where I no longer want to work in my garden when I'm home alone. More people have been approaching our home lately. Me, my partner, and even his mom on separate occasions have been asked for things. We've had multiple things stolen, mostly small, but with kids, things get left outside. Do you have a homeless camp within a block or two of your home? And if so, how do you deal with it? That is the question. How do you deal with it? And my question would be, is this something we should expect citizens to deal with, or is this something we should expect law enforcement to do this? If there's a pattern of petty crime, do we expect the law enforcement to deal with this, or do we expect them to be too busy with more serious crimes because they don't have the resources to investigate all of the crimes? That is what I would ask. But these are some of the responses they got. People saying, yes, I've noticed a sudden large increase of a homeless population at Town Road Shopping Center on Glenwood. Or, we're close to New Bern. There has been a significant increase in homeless people everywhere here. And also, to be fair, the homeless camp near me has always been there. It's just gotten a lot bigger over the last few years, so it isn't something so shocking to me. Not much you can really do. Just lock your stuff up and get comfortable with saying no and never answer the door when someone knocks. Is this really how we expect citizens to live? Oh, you have to make sure all of your stuff locks up, because if you leave anything outside, homeless people will steal it. Oh, don't answer the door when people you knock. Is this really how we want to live? Or can we say, hey, we want more police so that we don't have to live like this. We want, we want them to actually investigate and prosecute crimes. Others, get better at saying no. Is this really how we want to have to live? So, don't. And another user, that one time I forgot to lock my door in my driveway, they ransacked my car. Is this how we want to live? And so another person, talking about even people who are sympathetic to the homeless, giving them groceries and stuff, they're still, having this experience of just being harassed by homeless, the pattern of crime that comes along with the homeless encampment. So looking at it from the perspective of law enforcement activity, well, when the police do take action, what do? They know that there's an increase in crime. They know that the homeless people are stealing stuff, harassing people. What do? Do they go and make sure that those crimes are prosecuted, that the homeless people who are stealing are prosecuted for theft, the homeless people who are harassing are prosecuted for, under the anti-harassment ordinances? No, they just tell the homeless people, hey, you have to move. Now they might have the option to go to a shelter, or they just set up the homeless encampment somewhere else and start preying on the people there, doing their repeat behavior of criminality. If these people were in prison, you wouldn't have to worry about making sure you don't, not even once, leave your car unlocked. Not even once leave anything remotely of value outside, because people will steal it and sell it for, let's face it, drugs. So in this case, do these crimes make it into the crime numbers? Probably not. If you're at the point where you're saying, what can I do about the homeless people always stealing my stuff? Are we really to believe that that person is reporting every theft from a homeless person to the Raleigh police? No. What the vast majority of the commenters have in common, they're not saying, oh, call the police and the police will deal with it. Maybe one or two. Most of the commenters are saying, oh, this is what you need to do, because they're not expecting the police to deal with the problem. So if they're not expecting the police to deal with it, why would they even bother reporting it? So are all these instances of whatever it technically is, whether it's technically robbery or larceny, are they making it into the crime numbers? Probably not. And even so, they still have, even without all these other, unreported crimes, they still have that abysmally low clearance rate. Next story, I believe this is the last one from Raleigh, but the principals of a Southeast Raleigh magnet high school reported no injuries and no arrests as of yet after a Friday night football game, which turned into multiple fights in the parking lot and shots fired. Now, I saw some of the video. It does appear that Raleigh police were on scene, but we're still hearing that no arrests were made, with multiple fights, with gunshots, but no arrests. Seems odd to me. Now, police are not omniscient, and they can only work with the evidence they're able to gather. And I would presume that whatever culture is in the parking lot of this high school, it is not a culture that is prone to snitching, that is prone to providing evidence to the police. So we can only lay this at the foot of the police so much. But let me say this. We might like to think of children as innocent. That is often how we treat them under the law, that they are less morally capable for their actions. That's why we have juvenile courts that are separate from adult courts. But the truth is, if you are already committing violent crimes in school as a juvenile, you're probably going to continue committing violent crimes as an adult. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart far from it. It also goes the other way. If you train up your child without self-control to get angry, to commit crime, to be violent, to steal stuff, whatever, if they're raised that way as children, there's a pretty good chance they're going to continue that pattern into adulthood. That is the unfortunate truth. No one wants to crack down hard on children who are violent, but violent children turn into violent adults. And people sometimes talk about the school to prison pipeline as if they're somehow wanting children to turn out into violent criminals as adults and end up in prison. But the school to prison pipeline is real, because the same children that misbehave in school, even if it's not quite to the level of criminality, the children that misbehave in school are most likely to be misbehaving in society. So yes, there is a school to prison pipeline, and we probably need to strengthen it. Our next story here, a Johnson County man accused of killing his father. So Anthony Lee White was found dead of a gunshot wound at a sleep-in in Garner, where he lived and worked. And his son, David Lamont White, 20, of Anger, has been charged in his death. Now, I looked it up. I didn't see any criminal record for David Lamont White. So I won't lay this at the feet of the Johnson County Sheriff, because they investigate, they make this arrest. Now, if this is someone's first crime, how are the police going to know before they commit any crime that they're going to commit a crime? Well, once again, the police aren't omniscient. The police are not prophets. They cannot know. This isn't Minority Report. They can't know who is going to commit a crime. And so if it's someone who has not shown evidence of repeat criminal behavior, we can't really say, hey, thoroughly investigating and prosecuting crime might have kept this person in prison. If this was the first crime he committed, well, unfortunately, we can't really lay that at the feet of law enforcement to stop crime. And our last story here, along these same lines, a 15-year-old charged with murdering 3 members of his family at his aunt's birthday party. Now, this is a very tragic story. So, Jacarion Cunningham, 15 years old, that is the name I saw in some of the news, and at least one of the news reports, is charged with fatally shooting his aunt, his uncle, and his grandmother during a birthday party at their home in Harnett County. So the report is that Cunningham had been taken in by his aunt and uncle to hopefully give him a better life, and for whatever reason, he allegedly ended up turning to murder. He fled in a vehicle from the scene. The deputies were able to track him down and arrest him in the woods near Spring Lake. Now, if you're a 15-year-old and you're going to live with your aunt and uncle, presumably that is because you're in a bad situation with your parents, whatever, who you were previously with. Maybe you are getting in trouble and they hope that a better environment would change things for you. Unfortunately, it seems this young man has gone down a dark path. But once again, can we lay that at the feet of law enforcement? It looks like my stream might have died. Anyway, I'm going to keep talking. Oh well, we're about to finish up. So basically, yeah, for a 15-year-old, a triple homicide, is that his first instance of misbehavior? Probably not. But could the police be reasonably expected to engage in any course of action that would have prevented this? Unfortunately, very likely not. So that's it for the crime edition. I think these numbers are really important to understand the crime numbers that we see. It's not just about the number of crimes that can tell you whether we need more police. I think the clearance rate is perhaps a much better indicator. Now, perhaps the police are just extremely inefficient and bad at their jobs. I kind of doubt it. I think the police do try to solve crimes, even in Democrat-run jurisdictions where they might not be the most popular. They might not have the most backing from the city. I think they do genuinely still try to solve crimes. But as we can see, the fact that they're not getting great results might be more indicative of the resources they have and not, their motivation. Maybe they don't actually care about solving crime, but maybe all it would take is, the president calling in resources, bringing them resources, giving them the resources to actually keep the streets safe. And maybe we would not only see more crimes being solved, but less crimes actually happening, more, a greater percentage of crimes being reported. And that, once again, paradoxically, giving people trust that the police will actually investigate their crimes might look on paper like an increase in crime, just because people are more likely to report the crime that is happening. And that would be good if more people are reporting crimes. But it will look bad on paper because it will look like you have a higher crime rate. So once again, the numbers aren't everything. And yes, police vigorously enforcing the law, being active in arresting more criminals, even on seemingly less minor offenses, if that results in more repeat criminals being in jail, being in prison, that will result in less crime for the law-abiding citizens who they would otherwise be victimizing. And that is all for tonight.